They called it a delousing wagon, but the truth was heavier than the word could carry. The year was 1940, and in the quiet corners of occupied Poland, a new kind of engine was being built, not to carry supplies or soldiers, but death itself. Smoke, metal, and silence filled the air at the factory yard where the modified truck stood waiting. Its thick steel walls gleamed under a pale winter sun, and a single pipe curled from the back of the cab like a snake. The men who built it said it was for hygiene, a way to make the process clean. But everyone who stood near it knew that nothing about it was clean. Inside the workshop, an engineer adjusted his goggles and checked the seals. His name was unknown to most, just another technician following orders from Berlin. The instructions came stamped with the Reich Eagle and signed by men whose titles carried power like a weapon. The engine had been altered so that its exhaust could be redirected. The fumes that once drove the truck forward would now be the weapon. It was not called murder. It was called efficiency. Outside, SS officers watched in silence. They had been told this was a test. The victims, they said, were the unfit, the useless mouths of society, the patients of a Polish asylum. They were told it was mercy. When the truck doors opened, the first group stepped forward, their eyes glassy with confusion. They carried nothing. Some still wore hospital gowns, the cloth thin and frayed. A soldier told them it was a relocation. He smiled as he spoke, the way one does when trying to convince a child. The ramp clanged under their feet as they climbed in. The doors closed behind them with a dull metallic thud. The driver climbed into his seat, struck a match, and lit a cigarette. He exhaled once, slowly, before starting the engine. The noise filled the courtyard, a steady rumble that masked everything else. Inside, the air began to change. The passengers coughed, then clawed at the walls. Their hands left streaks where they hit the metal. The sound grew faint after a few minutes. The engineer took notes, recording time, pressure, and temperature, as though it were any other test. When the doors finally opened, the silence that spilled out was thicker than the smoke. The SS officer in charge gave a short nod. It worked. Within weeks, more trucks were ordered. Factories that once made bread, vans, and delivery vehicles began converting them into mobile chambers. The euphemism spread faster than truth. They were not killing machines, they were delousing wagons, a tool to cleanse and purify. In Berlin, reports arrived neatly typed, marked with words like capacity and throughput. In the field, drivers learned how to angle the truck uphill so the bodies would pile neatly toward the back. In the cold mornings of Poland, villagers saw the grey trucks pass by, heavy and silent, leaving behind the faint scent of exhaust. They did not know what to call it, but the men inside the uniforms already had a name. They called it progress. In the winter of 1941, a thin smoke hung over Berlin, curling from chimneys and factories, drifting into the grey sky. Inside one of the city's government buildings, behind heavy oak doors, men in black uniforms sat around a long table. Files were stacked in neat piles, marked with numbers instead of names. The sound of boots on marble echoed faintly through the halls. The men gathered belonged to the SS and the Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, where orders did not feel like crimes but calculations. The topic of the meeting was efficiency. The killing squads in the east, the Einsatzgruppen, had already murdered hundreds of thousands through shootings. But reports were coming back, describing the toll it took on the men who pulled the triggers. Some had grown sick, others drank heavily, a few could not continue. Ammunition costs were rising. A problem had formed that the SS called psychological strain. The solution would not be mercy, but method. At the head of the table, an officer read from a report. He explained that mobile gas vans had shown promise in the Wartherland district, offering results without waste. No bullets, no witnesses, just engine, exhaust, and silence. But the process needed refinement. The vans were too small, the engines overheated, and sometimes the drivers complained of the smell. One man in the room, Dr. August Becker, was tasked with inspecting these vehicles. Becker was a chemist, a technical mind who saw systems, not people. When he spoke, he did not use the word killing. He used words like process and capacity. He suggested better seals, stronger pipes, and tighter timing to reduce driver exposure. Others nodded and took notes. Outside, snow fell quietly on the city, covering the streets in white. While inside, the men discussed how to make murder cleaner. Becker proposed using larger Sora trucks instead of the smaller Opel models. The Soras could hold more people, nearly twice as many, and their diesel engines produced more carbon monoxide, faster. He also advised installing small electric lamps inside the compartments so that victims would enter calmly, believing they were being transported or disinfected. One officer joked that it was a brilliant invention, a perfect machine. No one laughed loudly, but the corners of mouths turned upward. The minutes of that meeting would later disappear into archives, buried among logistical memos, but the results would roll out onto the roads of occupied Europe within weeks. Orders were signed, new vans commissioned, drivers trained. Becker was sent east to oversee the first operations, making sure the vans functioned smoothly. His reports came back efficient, clinical, free of emotion. He wrote that the vans should be parked on inclines to allow for better stacking of the bodies, that drivers must not stand near the exhaust, that the doors should only be opened after 30 minutes to ensure full completion. In those rooms, the language of bureaucracy turned murder into math. Outside, Berliners hurried through the snow, clutching ration cards, unaware that inside those offices, men were measuring death by the litre, calling it progress and labelling it efficient. The road to Chelmno was narrow and frozen, a ribbon of dirt and ice twisting through the Polish countryside. It was early morning in 1942, and the mist hung low over the trees. A grey Sora truck crawled along the path, its engine rumbling like a tired beast. Inside the sealed compartment, the air was thick and growing thinner with every turn of the wheels. The driver, a young SS man named Hermann, kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other trembling on his cigarette. He had done this run before. He knew the timing. 15 minutes to the forest clearing, 10 more before silence. Behind him, the screams had already started. The truck shook as fists pounded against the metal walls. Hermann gritted his teeth and pressed harder on the pedal, but the truck jolted suddenly, coughing black smoke. The engine sputtered once, twice, then went still. A cloud of exhaust drifted past his window, the only sound the wind scraping across the field. Panic flickered in his eyes. He turned the key again. Nothing. The engine was dead. From the back came the sound of hands clawing, metal bending, voices rising. He knew what was happening inside. The pressure was building. The air inside the van, thick with exhaust, was not enough to finish what had begun. Now it was turning back on itself. Hermann stumbled out of the cab, the cold biting through his uniform. He shouted for help, but the forest answered with silence. A second driver, waiting up the road, saw the smoke and came running. Together they tried to restart the engine, pounding on the hood, twisting the ignition until sparks flew. Still nothing. The walls of the van groaned. The sound from inside was no longer words, just muffled roars of panic and fear. One of the doors began to bulge outward, the metal bending from within. Hermann stepped back, shouting for the others to stay clear. Then it happened. A dull boom split the air as one of the seals ruptured, releasing a wave of thick, toxic gas. The stench of exhaust and death mixed with the cold morning air. The men covered their faces and stumbled back, coughing. Smoke poured from the broken hinges. When the noise stopped, they waited. Minutes passed before anyone dared to approach. The van door hung open, twisted like foil. Inside, the bodies were tangled, their faces grey, their hands locked together. Herman stared at them, his cigarette still burning between his fingers. The officer who arrived later that day took notes, his expression blank. He called it a mechanical failure. The report that reached Berlin described it as an accident due to overpressure, but in truth, the system had broken under its own weight. The van, meant to kill cleanly, had turned chaotic. The Sora model that day was written off as unsalvageable. Orders soon followed to move operations towards stationary facilities. The gas vans had done their work, but they were flawed. They were slow, dangerous, and unstable. That morning outside Chelmno, with the trucks silent and steaming, the SS learned that their machines could die too. Efficiency, once their proud word, had met its first limit, and from its failure, something even darker was about to rise. By the spring of 1942, the roads of occupied Poland were filled with more wrecks than working machines. The Sora trucks that once rumbled toward forests and fields were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. Tires shredded, fuel lines froze, and engines coughed themselves to death. The SS drivers cursed the cold, the mud, and the endless repairs. Each breakdown was a delay, and delays were dangerous. Headquarters wanted results, measured not in victories, but in numbers. At first, the solution seemed simple. Bigger vans, stronger engines, tighter schedules. But the engineers knew the truth. The machines were collapsing under the scale of what they were being asked to do. Every kilometre meant another chance for witnesses. Every breakdown meant spilled evidence. The SS planners in Lublin and Berlin began to speak in new terms. No more moving vans, no more engines that needed gasoline and patience. They wanted stillness. They wanted control. From those meetings came a new idea, one that would soon take shape in 3 names whispered across the East: Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. Fixed facilities, they called them, stations of processing. Unlike the vans, they would not move. The victims would come to them. The plan was called Operation Reinhard, named for Reinhard Heydrich, who had been assassinated in Prague that year. His death gave the project a name, but the engine behind it was the same cold logic that had built the vans. At Belzec, construction began under SS officer Christian Wirth. Wooden walls, concrete floors, a diesel engine taken from a captured Soviet tank. The exhaust was piped into chambers disguised as showers. The design was efficient, simple, and horrifying. Where the vans could carry 50 or 60, these rooms could take hundreds at once. No wheels, no breakdowns, no roads to clog with smoke. In Warsaw, reports circulated quietly. The new camps were working faster than anyone imagined. Bodies were buried in pits, then burned when the earth could hold no more. The old mobile units were being retired, replaced by permanent structures that could run day and night. August Becker, the engineer who once adjusted valves and seals for the vans, was reassigned to inspect the new systems. His notes described the transition without emotion. He called it progress. The drivers who once steered death through villages were now reassigned as guards, their trucks parked in depots to rust. In the countryside, the people noticed the change. The roads grew quieter, but the trains began to move. Long lines of cattle cars wound their way through the forests, heading toward the same places where the vans had once gone. But now, the killing would not depend on engines that failed or drivers who hesitated. It would depend only on arrival. At Chelmno, the first camp to use vans, the method shifted too. The pits deepened, the fires grew hotter. The mobile era of death was ending, replaced by something colder, something rooted to the ground. When the vans finally stopped rolling, the silence they left behind was not relief. It was the sound of something worse beginning, a new kind of stillness, where death no longer had to move to find its victims. By the summer of 1942, even the war machine of the Reich began to wheeze. The Eastern Front devoured fuel faster than refineries could replace it. Army convoys took priority, leaving the SS transports scraping the bottom of their tanks. At Chelmno, the grey Sora truck sat in a field, half loaded, its driver staring at the gauge that trembled just above empty. The victims, mostly Jewish families from nearby villages, had already been herded inside. The doors were sealed, the pipe locked in place, the orders the same as always. But when the driver turned the key, the engine coughed and sputtered. He tried again. The noise came weakly, then faded into silence. The smell of gasoline lingered in the air, but the tank was nearly dry. Inside the van, the people began to pound on the walls, calling out through the metal. The officer in charge shouted for his men to fetch more fuel, but there was none to find. The barrels in the shed were already scraped clean. The driver pressed the pedal again, hoping for a miracle. The engine caught for a moment, a rough roar that spat thick black smoke, but then something went wrong. The exhaust backdrafted through the pipes, flooding the driver's cabin instead of the sealed chamber. He coughed violently, tearing open the door to escape the fumes. The men nearby watched in confusion as the truck shook, the rear doors rattling. Inside, panic rose. The prisoners screamed louder, pounding until dents formed in the steel. One of the guards hesitated. The officer yelled at him to hold his position, but the sound was drowned out by the groan of metal straining under fists and elbows. Then, with a sharp crack, one of the hinges tore loose. A narrow line of light broke through the darkness inside. A hand reached out, grabbing at the cold air, and, for a heartbeat, the field froze. A prisoner stumbled out, gasping, his face grey and streaked with sweat. 2 others followed before the guards raised their rifles. The shots came fast, echoing through the trees. The officer shouted for silence, for order, but his voice shook. When it was over, the van stood motionless, the engine still dead. Smoke rose in thin spirals from the exhaust pipe. The men stood around it, silent, waiting for someone to speak. The officer finally muttered that this would not happen again. He blamed the driver, the fuel, the cold, anything but the truth. The next morning, a report went to headquarters. It listed mechanical failure, insufficient gasoline, minor unrest. It did not mention that the system itself was falling apart. The trucks needed constant maintenance, and every shortage exposed their weakness. Fuel, the lifeblood of the machine, was being drained by the front. The SS called it an inconvenience, but it was more than that. It was the first sign that their so-called efficiency was unsustainable. When the gas ran out, both in the tank and in the idea that powered it, the machine began to choke on its own design. What they had built to be unstoppable was now stalling in the mud, and for the first time they faced the quiet terror of their invention failing them. By the autumn of 1942, the SS began to admit what their reports refused to say aloud. The vans were failing. Engines broke down, fuel was scarce, and even when they worked, the smell gave them away. The ground itself was starting to tell stories. Graves near Chelmno and the forests of eastern Poland were swelling, the soil splitting as gases from the buried bodies rose through the earth. Local villagers whispered about the strange movement of the ground, about dogs that dug up bones. What had been hidden was now surfacing. In Berlin, new orders were written in the same calm language that had once described the vans. The command was simple. The dead must disappear. Fire, not exhaust, would now do the work. The directive came under the name Sonderaktion 1005, a special operation meant to erase the traces of what had already been done. The SS officers called it efficiency. The first tests began in Chelmno. Work crews, made of prisoners, were ordered to dig up the mass graves. They worked in silence, choking on the stench of decay. The bodies were unrecognizable, tangled and grey, soaked with rainwater and oil. The SS guards watched with rags tied around their faces to block the smell. When the pits were open, the next phase began. Wooden logs were stacked in layers, alternating with the corpses, and doused with gasoline. A match was struck. The fire took quickly, flames rising higher than the trees, black smoke curling into the cold sky. The guards called it clean. The prisoners called it hell. The crackling of burning flesh and the hiss of moisture turned the air thick and oily. The fires burned for days, and when the logs turned to ash, the bones were crushed with shovels and scattered into the nearby river. The same orders spread across other sites, to Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Majdanek. The goal was the same everywhere: erase the evidence. By 1943, thousands of bodies had been dug up and set alight. The SS men reported that the fires worked better than expected. Open-air burning, they wrote, was cheaper, faster, and left almost nothing behind. To them, it was success. To the prisoners forced to feed the flames, it was the end of everything human. Some tried to look away, but the heat forced their eyes open. The smell of burning hair and bone clung to their clothes, their skin, their dreams. One man who survived later said that the sky itself turned red and stayed that way for days. In the camp logs, the language remained clean and mechanical. Volume, output, completion rate. It was the same rhythm that had once described fuel and exhaust, now applied to fire and ash. The SS had found their new method, one that needed no maintenance, no roads, no engines. Just wood, gasoline, and human labour. Fire did not stall or run dry. Fire obeyed. In their reports, they called it efficiency. But in the forests of Poland, the trees still whispered what the smoke carried, that the efficiency they built was not progress, but the perfection of destruction. They called them shower rooms. The word itself was harmless, even comforting. It sounded clean, ordinary, familiar. But behind the walls, nothing was ordinary. The deception began long before the victims arrived. Signs were painted, benches were placed near entrances. At some camps, fake showerheads were fixed into the ceilings, empty and useless, meant only to complete the illusion. The SS understood that calm made their work faster. Panic slowed everything down, and to them, time was a resource. At the camps and in the mobile vans, the same pattern repeated. The labels changed, but the purpose never did. A van marked as a delousing wagon, a room labelled as disinfection. The officers said the people inside were not being killed, they were being processed. That single word, process, stripped away humanity. Each group became a unit, a shipment, a number on a report. The language of logistics covered the reality of murder like a mask. August Becker's reports spoke of exhaust flow and ventilation, never of people. Engineers adjusted valves to ensure optimal distribution. Guards spoke about the loading and unloading time of cargo. To outsiders, it might have sounded like a delivery service, but it was death disguised as routine. The vans themselves were built with precision. The compartments were sealed so tightly that no light entered once the doors closed. The pipe carrying engine fumes was attached to the floor, designed to distribute carbon monoxide evenly through the space. The victims often realized too late what was happening. At first, the air grew heavy. Some sat down, thinking the journey was simply rough. Then came the coughing, the panic, the pounding on the walls. But outside, the driver watched the timer on his dashboard. 10 minutes. 15. Then silence. When the doors opened again, the smell of exhaust and sweat poured out. The driver called for the cleaning team. Prisoners forced to remove the bodies, wash the floor, and close the doors for the next run. At the fixed facilities, the design became more complex, but no less deceptive. The so-called shower rooms were built with tiled walls and even small drains in the floor to make the illusion convincing. The victims were told to undress, to remember where they left their belongings, to take note of their hooks. The guards smiled as they said it. The calmness, the absence of force, was part of the plan. Once the doors were locked, the engine started, or the gas flowed through hidden pipes. It was always mechanical, always routine. Inside the SS offices, diagrams of these chambers were drawn in clean lines, annotated with terms like capacity and airflow. Engineers debated the placement of pipes, not ethics. One man later testified that he took pride in improving the seals, calling it good craftsmanship. To him, it was work, not killing. That was the heart of the camouflage. It was not only the victims who were deceived, it was the killers themselves. The system made them believe they were not committing murder, only performing a task. In the end, the language, the design, and the lies all worked together to hide the truth. The world's most efficient disguise was not the fake showerhead or the painted sign. It was the word they used to describe it all: process. The first thing he remembered was the sound, the clanging of metal, the slam of a latch, the sudden hush that followed. It was December of 1941, and the cold crept into his bones as he stood shoulder to shoulder with others inside the van. The space was small, the air already damp with breath. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else coughed. The floor vibrated beneath their feet as the engine turned over. At first, the noise brought hope. They thought they were being moved to another camp, perhaps to work, perhaps to survive another day. Then the smell came, thick, sharp, bitter. It burned the throat. He realized too late that the air was changing. The first to fall were the children. They slumped quietly against the walls, their mothers screaming their names. People pushed toward the doors, pounding, clawing, desperate for air. The sound was not human anymore. It was the sound of panic turned into a single terrible rhythm, fists and cries blending into the roar of the engine. The van rocked slightly as if it were breathing. He felt his lungs tighten, his legs shaking. He tried to cover his mouth, to find a pocket of air near the corner, but there was none left. The world began to shrink, the light in his mind dimming. He did not remember falling, only waking. He was lying among bodies, his face pressed against a leg that no longer moved. The door was open, daylight spilling in. He did not know how long it had been. Hands dragged him out, rough voices shouting in German. They thought he was dead, but he was still breathing. He lay still, letting his body go limp. He heard laughter, boots scraping on dirt. The guards smoked cigarettes as they worked, pulling the others out, stacking them like firewood. He waited until they turned away before rolling into a shallow ditch. He buried himself beneath the snow and stayed there until night fell. Years later, after liberation, he tried to explain what it felt like inside that van. Words failed him. He said the air was alive, that it pressed against your skin, that you could taste it. He remembered the way people clung to each other in the dark, strangers holding strangers. He said it was not death that frightened him most, but the silence that followed when the screaming stopped. When he was found by soldiers in 1945, he was half-starved and grey-haired, though only 20. They asked him to describe what he saw. He told them the bodies were blue, wet with sweat and urine, the legs covered in blood. He told them about the smell that never left, not even years later. He said sometimes at night he still heard the engine start, still felt the vibration under his feet. They wrote down his story in neat handwriting, but he knew it was more than paper could hold. The van had become a memory that lived inside him, a prison that no liberation could undo. When the war ended in 1945, the smoke had already faded, but the ground still told the truth. In the forests near Chelmno, Soviet soldiers moved cautiously through the wreckage. The air carried a sour smell, not of battle, but of what had been buried and burned. They found metal pieces first, warped and half sunk in mud, the remains of trucks. One still had its engine block intact, the pipe leading from the exhaust twisted and blackened. It took only a few minutes for the engineers to understand what they were looking at. This was not a transport vehicle. It was a weapon. Nearby, they uncovered a field of bones mixed with ash, a silent testimony that could no longer be hidden. Investigators began collecting documents, letters, and technical memos left behind in abandoned offices. They found reports signed by Dr. August Becker and others like him, men who had written about airflow, gas pressure, and seal integrity as though they were designing heating systems. In one report, Becker referred to improvements that made the vans more efficient, reducing driver discomfort and fuel use. He had used the word efficient 3 times in a single paragraph. To the investigators, that word cut deeper than any confession. It revealed the mindset that had turned killing into paperwork. In Hamburg, the name Gustav Labs appeared in captured records. He had driven one of the vans at Chelmno. When he was finally located after the war, he claimed he was only following orders. During his trial, he spoke softly, describing his routine as if reading from a schedule. He said he did not look inside the compartment, that his duty was to drive and wait. When asked if he knew what was happening, he said yes, but added that everyone knew survivors were brought in to testify. One man stood in the courtroom and described the sound of the van as it started, the screams that followed, and the smell that lingered after it stopped. He spoke quietly, his voice trembling. The judges sat in silence. On the tables lay photographs of the vans, diagrams found in SS files, and fragments of pipes recovered from the camps. The evidence was overwhelming, yet the tone of the records was what shocked most people. Every note was clinical, every murder disguised as procedure. Becker's letters from 1942 were read aloud. He wrote about delays due to weather, about the importance of sealing the doors tightly, about the need to clean the vehicles quickly between uses. Not once did he mention the people inside. In those lines, the word human never appeared. Across Europe, similar investigations took place, uncovering more vans in Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states. The pattern was always the same. The machines were destroyed, the documents burned, but the memory of their use survived through those who had seen them. The trials did not erase the horror, but they exposed the truth hidden beneath the language of efficiency. The men who had once called their work clean now stood in rooms that smelled faintly of smoke and ink, forced at last to face what their own words could no longer disguise. When the war was over, the word efficiency no longer sounded clean. It carried the echo of engines, the hiss of exhaust, and the crackle of fire. What began as a technical pursuit had become a symbol of how ordinary systems could be twisted into instruments of death. The story of the gas vans was not just about machines, but about the people who built them, the men who believed that speed and order could make killing easier to bear. In the beginning, they called it progress. They spoke of solving problems, of saving time and fuel. But every improvement, every adjustment, turned murder into a process measured in minutes and meters. When the vans broke down, when the fuel tanks ran dry, the idea behind them did not die. It simply changed shape. Fire replaced gas. Stationary chambers replaced engines. The method evolved, but the goal remained the same. The Holocaust became not only a human tragedy, but an industrial one, a reflection of what happens when morality is stripped away from efficiency. The same hands that once built delivery trucks built death vans. The same engineers who calculated airflow in factories calculated it again for chambers. Each small step seemed logical, rational, necessary, until it formed a system that destroyed millions. The efficiency they sought was not in saving resources, but in removing hesitation. It allowed men to kill without seeing, to murder through machines, to separate the act from the feeling. That distance was their shield. When the vans were first tested in 1940, they were seen as a solution to the emotional strain of shooting squads. The reports said that the men no longer had to face the victims. They could simply drive. The machine would do the rest. That was the birth of mechanical murder. But every system that hides suffering from the human eye eventually collapses under its own weight. The vans broke. The chambers cracked. The fires, meant to erase evidence, filled the skies with smoke that could not be ignored. When the gas ran out, the machine turned to fire, and even fire could not hide the truth. After the war, the world tried to understand how it happened, how men who loved order could build chaos, how words like capacity, throughput, and efficiency could replace mercy. The lesson was not about engines or chemistry, but about the choices hidden in ordinary work. Each form, each memo, each adjustment of a valve showed how evil can disguise itself as organization. Remembering the gas vans is not only about the victims who died inside them, but about the warning they carry. The warning that systems without conscience can turn any goal, even order itself, into destruction. The vans may have stopped rolling, their engines long silent, but the idea they represented still asks a question that must never be ignored. What happens when we stop asking why and only ask how?